Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on societal impact of research at universities. I am Karin Sipido. I am the chair of a working group at KU Leuven, and with me is Kirstien Davidsen and Dirk Smits, members of the working group, who will help guide this webinar along. So before we introduce the speakers and hear their contributions, I'd like to say a few words about the background to this webinar and the working group. So this working group actually grew out previous work from the Council for Research Policy at the university, and at one point it was decided that the working group would take forward the topic of societal impact to provide further analysis and to develop proposals on embedding of societal impact in research at university. You see here a list of people who are the members of this working group. We are all members of the working group in our personal capacity. We're not representing other groups, but we are a diverse group of younger, more experienced, and different expertise of researchers within the university. Although we were appointed in the summer of 2020, there was some interruption because of the COVID, but we resumed to work about a year ago, and we are now well in progress towards writing our report. So let me explain just in one slide, if this moves forward. It doesn't? Yeah, there we are. So the idea of the working group is that we would work from the viewpoint of the academic researcher. So this cartoon presents on the left-hand side, you see typically what a researcher within the university considers as tasks and assignment. We teach, we do research, we provide service to society, and those three together form our activities. Now, people who look from the outside, and especially when you think of funders of our activities, the government, funding organizations that provide grants or positions, they like to look at what we do from the point of view of impact. And we can talk about scientific impact, we can talk about economic impact, and societal impact is maybe the one that people are looking for more eagerly, more recently, but also one that is not so well known. And if you ask why are people interested, there's an interesting definition and description of why. To do advocacy for research, why it is important to society, to also analyze what we are doing and what are the consequences of that. Also accountability, we are using taxpayers' money. And finally also, and that is the one that somehow in the university people will be more familiar with, allocation of funding. I'm going to just briefly introduce the 5 chapters, how they relate to the webinar. We have in our report that will be finished in the coming 2 months, we have talked about types of impact, what is societal impact. We have talked about the pathways to impact and what units do you need to achieve it. We have also talked about reference systems. How can we aim for impact and how do we reference that? What are the standards against which we can measure? But then comes with that, how do you evaluate? And finally, we are discussing what are steering mechanisms. All of these topics are in the expertise of our speakers, much more than our expertise. We have our internal view, and we thought it was time to hear from people who have more experience, more expertise, and also introduce the topic and the work to the community at university. So over to Kirstien, who will introduce the speakers.
Thank you very much, Karin. Well, we will start with the final topic, so the one about steering mechanisms. And it is our great pleasure to have Professor Gunning Schepers here, who will be talking about societal needs and expectations driving the research funding agenda. How is this driving academic research design and organization? Professor Gunning-Schepers combines an impressive research track record with an equally impressive career in academic governance. She has held many important academic positions and governance positions internationally and nationally. And I think we can say that all her work has been strongly grounded in Netherlands. She is Professor Emerita of Social Medicine from the University of Amsterdam. Her research concentrates on modeling population health for policy and prevention purposes, and she is also concerned with health equity and inequalities. She was Dean of the Faculty of Medicine and later President of the University of Amsterdam, positions which of course require a lot of vision and leadership. Currently she is the chair of the board of Schiphol and of many other non-executive board memberships, but particularly relevant to her talk now is that she was chair from 2016 to 2018 of the National Research Agenda, a big national project aimed at improving the societal impact of research in the Netherlands. So it is with great pleasure that we give the floor to you, Professor Schepers, Gunning-Schepers.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, and it's a delight to be able to tell you a little bit about that experience. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you two examples that I've been very heavily involved with myself, in which I think societal impact has been important, not so much as something that is being pushed by researchers, but whereby a pool has been organized by society to try and get the research out of academia. And I'm absolutely convinced that that sense of ownership as to the work researchers do within university or within institutes is maybe the best way to organize your impact before the results even occur. So can I have the next slide? I think that impact matters, and it's important for both researchers and society. And to present them as if they were a contradiction, I think doesn't do justice to how important impact is to every single researcher. Otherwise, we wouldn't publish and we wouldn't look so critically at who cites us. Citations and publications are a way of having or measuring our impact on the scientific field that we hope to give a contribution to. And I think also the impact through teaching is a way in which we disseminate the results of what we've done in our own work or people before us through our students back in society. And I think all of us who have worked in academia know how carefully you filter which bits of knowledge and recent research you use in your teaching to try and get across that main element that you would like to give back to your students and through them back to society. So let's look at impact as something that we want to achieve and not something that keeps us from doing the things we much rather would be doing. And I think that if you approach it from that side, there are all kinds of opportunities that will offer themselves. Now, the two examples I'm going to give you will focus, now can I go back just a few more? Will focus on impact in the uptake in society. And I think we also should be broad in what we consider to be uptake. Policy applications, product developments, obviously the application of new knowledge in day-to-day work. And coming from medical field, and those of you who come from that area as well were recognized. For instance, the application of new knowledge in clinical guidelines and the importance that has in translating findings of research directly into patient care. And I think that all of those steps are greatly enhanced if the people who have to apply your new knowledge feel that they partly own also the process of the research that has led to it. And now moving on to the next slide, the two examples I want to discuss with you is one, the Dutch research agenda. It was already mentioned, which started in 2016, and I chaired that for part of its course. And the second one is regenerative medicine cross borders, RegMed XP, in which Flanders is also a very active participant. And that's an ongoing, important big project, which was very innovative in the way they set it up. And I'll give those examples of two projects that I've been involved in, which I think show how impact can help achieve very fundamental research projects. Next slide, please. This is the website as it is now from the Dutch research agenda. You can easily find it because it's a large research program now under NWO, which is our research council money, and there are all different disciplines involved. And it's interesting to go and have a look at that website to see in what way it differs from the traditional calls for proposals that the Research Council works on. Can I have the next slide? What happened in, next slide, please. Yes, what happened in 2016 was that the government wanted to think about a new white paper on research policy. And the then minister asked a couple of prominent people in society to think up of a way whereby you could set up a national research agenda. And the whole academic community immediately was on high alert because they sensed the feeling that government was then going to set the priorities of what they should be conducting their research on. And the two people who started out on the project were clever enough to turn it around in a different way. They said, actually, what helps legitimize research in a political environment, and certainly if you're looking for extra funding, is to see what society would like to have researched. So they set up a bold experiment whereby they opened up a website for 1 month, a portal, whereby anybody could submit questions. And there was a lot of attention on television, there was attention in other media. And then they opened the portal and they waited. And the first week, I think there was nothing. Nobody came to the portal and they got very, very worried. And then suddenly it took off. And in the end, at the end of the month, there were 12,000 questions. And yes, for the cynics among you, half of them came from researchers who were very much afraid that in the future, their particular interest in research would not be part of the research agenda. But the other half came from the general public. And they came from young people, school children, up until people who were in different sectors in society. And with those 12,000 questions, they then had to go through a process of trying to see what could be done with them. And the National Academy, which has a group of young academics that are appointed there, the Young Academy was willing to spend a full weekend in which they clustered those questions, which were sometimes phrased differently, but addressed the same question, into 240 core questions. And the interesting part was that there was not a great deal of difference between what was asked from the academics and what was asked from the general public. They were sometimes worded differently, but it went from astronomy to very applied questions in terms of energy transition. Those 240 core questions were then published, and every single person who asked the question was put in contact with a researcher who was working on that area, either to tell them that the answer was already part of the findings that research had published, or to tell them what research was going on. There were small lectures giving in sitting rooms to some of the people who asked questions. There was a big knowledge festival in which many researchers were willing to address the general public. There was direct contact, as I said earlier, between anybody who asked the question and somebody who was working on that field. Schools participated. Many schools set up a project whereby they made a research agenda with their pupils. And the publication of those 240 questions turned out to be a much more liked guide to help secondary school pupils choosing their courses at university than the traditional material on those courses that was published by the universities. So it's had quite an impact as a project itself. But for the researchers, we hadn't set the step to renewing access to maybe more money, or at least changing around what the research agenda could be. So what we did in the 25 routes that you see mentioned above is to bring together many of these 240 core questions, address similar topics, whether they had to do with the energy transition, whether they had to do with astronomy, whether they had to do with new pharmaceutical developments. And in those routes, we tried to bring together all the different disciplines and different research groups that were working on such a topic to exchange and combine their methods and their questions in a way so that society could see how the individual questions researchers were addressing fitted in a bigger policy area that they could relate to. Next slide, please. When I look at what this research agenda provided for us, the goals were to get a revival of general interest in science and bring together researchers from different perspectives. That worked very well. There was a great deal of enthusiasm. We didn't have to put a lot of effort on that, on the push side, but also on the pull side. But I think the most interesting observation we came up with is the fact that if you're looking at how research results land in society, we have quite a construction for public-private collaboration in developing products and setting up startups and having money from private sector to invest in that gap between the end of an academic publication and the beginning of the application in society. We don't have similar mechanisms when we're talking about public-public conversions. So knowledge about what helps to give resilience to young people or resilience to communities is much more difficult to apply in society than a new form of technology that you want to start using as a product. And that is something that we then address in government, that you can only have impact in society if the ones who have to take over from the researchers have money and possibilities for using research results and making them into impact. So much the research agenda. I have a few minutes left. Next slide. I'd like to spend those on RegMed XB. Next slide. which, as I said, is regenerative medicine, from stem cells to renewed organ functions. It addresses 4 research topics with moonshots that are really aiming for the application to patients. And the innovative side there is that the starting money for very fundamental research in these 4 areas came through the health charities. And their only condition was that in using that money for the research, we would always have the focus on what needed to be done to make it into a product that would really help patients. So we joined forces with 4 fundamental research groups in 4 different university medical centers, with the government that was able to give quite a large subsidy to that, and private parties who were ready to take up the outcome of the research and translate them into patient benefits as early as possible. And these health charities, all through the process, which is now 5 years, keep challenging these research groups how much faster they can get it from the bench to the bedside. Last slide. Frank Luijten, coming from Leuven, has been extremely important there. He has been the medical director of RegMed XB, and his main function is to look at every step in the research, whether that will help accelerate the process of getting it approved ultimately. So which animal model are you going to be used? Is it the one that will help the application towards the end? Such a commitment requires a lot of positive reinforcement. And here the health charities have played an incredible, important role in pulling it and convincing national and regional governments that they should be investing in production facilities, in valorization and early investment funds ahead of the outcome of the research, as we did with COVID, to get the vaccines into production as soon as the research was ready to hand it over. And I think that we sometimes focus a lot about the topics that might change if we think about impact. But impact is much more how you organize the pipeline so that the outcome of sometimes very fundamental research has a good landing into society and can be picked up and is seen to be useful right from the start. And those 2 examples have shown me that there is not a lot of contradiction between impact or curiosity-driven research. It is more about making sure that the pipeline outside university is receptive and takes up the results as quickly as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Louise. Your 2 cases really went to the essence of the questions you were dealing with. So we will move on to the next presentation and the next speaker. The next speaker is Eric Arnold. Eric Arnold's CV is really cross-disciplinary. So he has a BA in English literature, an MSc in history and philosophy of science, and a PhD in science policy and microeconomics. His business is very much evaluation of research, including innovation and impact, obviously. He is professor at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, honorary professor at the University of Manchester. But most importantly, he is co-founder and chairman of the Technopolis Group. And when you look at the website of the Technopolis Group, you find the very inspiring mission there, that they want to support decision makers who want to achieve fair and sustainable growth through science, technology, innovation, health and education. So again, it is with great pleasure that we give the floor to Professor Arnold to talk about funding, governance and research impact.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Best of luck, we can make the technology work.
Er zijn niet meer in beeld, hè?
And here we go. So I want to talk at a fairly high level and probably quite quickly because I've got too many slides. Really about the way the funding situation and the way policy around research is being made and what that means for what we mean by impact. Okay. Impact is a weird concept anyway, that's worth several hours of discussion. It can be looked at ex post or ex ante. There are observer effects. It's a subset of evaluation in my world. It's usually interesting in relation to the management of the policy cycle or of research. It's theory-based. It's affected by context, so it's difficult and complicated to deal with. It's not neutral. The measuring stick interferes with the things or the people it measures. So it's a pretty weird thing. And if we look at the literature about impact from university research over the last few decades, the main tracks, the main channels of impact tend to be these. One is industrial innovation, and that's the thing that gets most of the attention. But there's also research influenced changes in policy, agenda setting, if you like. We're starting to talk about tackling grand or societal challenges. There's the provision of improved public goods, improved exercise of professional skill, for example, in medical practice, as Louise just mentioned. And last but absolutely not least, human capital development, which is the vector for an awful lot of these things. I want to talk a little bit about the way governance changes, or is changing over time. And in the discussion about this, people tend to sort of start with a post-Second World War period as if there were no history before that. Of course, governments have been funding science for a couple of thousand years at least in various forms. But the fuss, in a sense, really starts with Vannevar Bush's manifesto, if you like, Science, the Endless Frontier, where he proposes governance of research by the scientific community. And there's a big fight with the various departments of state in the USA. And in the end, defense keeps their research and health keeps their research. But you do get the National Science Foundation. Yeah. And there's a kind of theory that goes with this, which we talk about as the linear model, the idea that if you pour money on basic research, eventually good things happen in society. Then starting formally in about 1962 or 3 with the OECD's invention of science policy, which isn't policy about science, but policy that says society should influence what science does. We start thinking about actually understanding the links that might connect research to impact in society, understanding that this is a complex system, it's not just an arrow, and that linking scientific and technical opportunity to demand is central to getting impact. In the last 20 years or so, we started talking about societal challenges, more recently the Sustainable Development Goals. And now we're starting to say that it's not just a matter of doing research and making innovation, but we very urgently need to change the way certain socio-technical systems, I mean, the climate is the most obvious thing, but we actually need to force impact from new knowledge so that we don't all burn up, and so that various other horrific things like loss of biodiversity don't happen to us. And I would describe these things as generations here. Some other people call them framings. Important is that it's not that you move from one generation to the next, but one is layered on top of the other. So these things carry on happening in parallel. You know, Blue Skies research carries on happening at the same time as you tackle societal changes. I'm not going to present this slide. Key message is that there are fundamental theoretical changes in the way we understand or think about the relationship between research and impact at the boundaries between these generations. I hope the organisers can make these slides available. If not, you're very welcome to email me and ask for a copy if you really want to study these things in depth. I was asked to talk about funding mechanisms, and the way they change is quite interesting. You know, in the first generation, research councils tend to function as what Ari Rip calls aggregation machines. You know, if you look at the shape of the research community has a certain shape that affects the demand for research funding, goes into the research council, which chooses the best. And the pattern of grants that comes out looks very like the shape of the research community. Yeah. So there's a tendency to lock in, and very difficult in a sense to exert societal pressure. As we go to the second generation, we start thinking about research and innovation in a much broader system. We start thinking about innovation as a collective activity. Funders become change agents trying to fix some of the system failures in here. In addition, of course, to the research councils still existing and doing their traditional job. Now it gets really difficult to draw. This is Frank Hales, who's a wonderful researcher who does wonderful, horrible pictures. And it's basically trying to say that if you look at the big system, the innovation system within which we work, if you like, that contains socio-technical regimes, you know, combinations of science, technology, rules, practices, skills, infrastructures, which tend to be rather stable and quite difficult to tip over. Look at the fossil fuels problem in the generation of electricity. Historically, he says, there have been niche innovations that come up and tip over bits of that, to change from sailing ships to steamships, for example. In a sense, these things happen naturally, and our policy problem at the moment is that we actually have to force certain kinds of impacts to take place. Otherwise, we are in deep trouble as a species. Yeah? So we're exerting pressure from what, of course, he's an academic. He uses nice long words like socio-technical landscape. That's society and politics, if you like, exerting pressure, saying we have to get to certain kinds of changes. Right? So now we're beginning to think in really quite different terms. They're very, very big terms. Mariana Mazzucato produced a very, very interesting report for the European Commission, which they've actually acted on, saying in order to program things to do about these big socio-technical transitions, we need blocks which are still big, but small enough that we can work with them, which she calls missions. Yeah. So a mission, in effect, is a block or a pillar in one of these big transitions. And now there's an explosion of activity among different policymakers and funders, certainly within the OECD, trying to figure out how to do these missions. I'm in the middle of a project with the OECD about trying to figure out how you evaluate the way they work. If we then think about how these generations map to overall governance, this is a generic picture of what government or governance looks like, and universities and institutes and stuff fit into that. First generation government basically does this bit, which is the Ministry of Education, research councils, universities. Second generation pulls in industry, the innovation processes. And the third generation gets really messy because it's just about everything. Yeah. So when we think about impacts, correspondingly, the focus shifts from things very close to research through to massive changes in the way society works or the way societal needs are handled. Okay. So if we think about the governance systems, and we've had the debate, I think some of us before the audience arrived were having exactly the same debate about academic freedom and bottom-up research versus top-down. We have this period of blind delegation in the 50s and the 60s to the research community in the first generation. We got this increasing focus on societal impacts. And if you like, from the 1960s, there's a lot of work taking a quite macro view. What is the sort of aggregate effect of results of research in society? Then the new public management pops up starting in 1989 with the OECD's public management group. And one gets more and more interested in micro views, understanding the impacts of individual research, which in fact is a massively difficult problem, gets built into various kinds of research assessment systems with varying degrees of effectiveness, and most of them not that effective. Okay. The third generation is interesting and different, not only in the sense that it's bigger, but also in the sense that what we're doing in research and innovation is trying to refocus from pushing from research and innovation into society to starting with the problems in society that we need to solve. So in a sense, whereas we push forward in the first and second generation, with the third, we're trying to look at the solutions and work backwards from there into what we do in research funding. I think for the sake of speed, I'll skip those two. This is the way we tend to think in evaluation terms about goal setting and trying to predict what's going to come out of research and innovation programs, amongst others. And it basically says, there are some problems or issues in society. We persuade the finance minister to cough up some money. We make some interventions, which usually involve funding projects. Those projects make outputs. And then there's a chain of effects through various kinds of outcomes. And eventually, we hope, the creation of societal impacts. And the economic perspective on this, if you like, is that society's paying money at the beginning of the process to try and solve societal problems, and it gets its payback through the solution of those problems. Yeah. And this is the way we traditionally plan, and we go left to right. Yeah. And there's various things we think about, like how do we indicate progress? What assumptions are we making when we make this kind of program theory? And there's a huge gestalt that's beginning to happen in the funding organizations, which is how do we do this from the right-hand side? How are we much more focused on solutions, therefore impacts, and how do we work backwards in a way that's convincing? Because if you contrast that with traditional practice, which we caricature as fund and forget, you put some money somewhere into the left-hand end of this process, and then you go away and hope something good happens. Yeah. Now we're really starting to think about the other end. And for me, that implies within universities and other research performing organizations, thinking about impacts in a quite different way. Thinking about focusing on the impact very early in the process, at least for those parts of research funding which are relevant to deliberately creating societal impact. It's very easy when one talks about this to make it to sound as if one doesn't think basic research or bottom-up research is important. For me, it's massively important. We have to walk on two legs. Where we know there are problems, we can diagnose them and focus our efforts. For the rest of the universe and all the unknown unknowns, we need the basic research. We need the bottom-up stuff, so that we actually make the best use of our common ability to make knowledge. So if you think about these things as a kind of design process, then in many design processes, you look at needs and opportunities, you spread out. After a certain point, you start converging on solutions. And in a sense, what we're trying to do in the third generation stuff is to focus on that convergence. Right? So if we look at how we've been managing research impact in second generation funding policy, well, there's an awful lot of ex post impact studies of various degrees of quality. The economists, econometricians, statisticians like to do an awful lot of stuff in this area, very highly developed statistical techniques, which in various ways estimate or explain, if you like, the link between inputs and outputs, but usually don't tell us very much about the processes of transforming inputs into outputs. We've had this increased use of indicators inspired by the new public management, which is fine and lets you monitor what you're doing, but usually it's very difficult to construct indicators which tell you very much about what's going on as you get closer to the impacts, if you like. And we have an intellectual problem here too, in the sense that we don't actually have a meaningful philosophy of attribution. Now, the finance ministry always wants you to be able to explain, my funding program caused X% of the increase in gross domestic product over a certain period. Something very concrete, measured in money terms. And the problem is, if you actually look at chains of logic which go from action to impact, you see an awful lot of links that where the work or the preceding step is necessary but not sufficient. So I call it the X2000 problem, because I talk a lot in Sweden, and Sweden has its own leaning train, the X2000. And if I've traveled on the X2000 from Gothenburg to Stockholm, I then ask the question, well, did I get there because ASEA built the train, SJ, the railway company, built the track and the stations and supplied the railway driver, Vattenfall produced the power, and so on. Yeah. So each one of these things is necessary but not sufficient, and there's no logical way that you can actually attribute degrees of responsibility. Yeah. So that tradition is I find very frustrating, because in a way when you look at the reports, you almost get a feeling people are making up the numbers in the end. We've had, particularly in the UK, a focus on what was called here the impact agenda, which basically meant that researchers started to be asked about 20 years ago to explain the likely impacts of their research in their applications for funding. So ex ante. Why was that done? It was literally done in order to protect the science budget from attack by the Treasury in around 2000, when the science budget was in some serious danger. And that idea is then moved into the research assessment exercise in 2014, which was a massive version of the kind of thing that Louise was talking about earlier on. One of the things that was put into that exercise was, in addition to lots of worrying about quality, researchers were asked to write impact statements, explanations of how their past research had led to socioeconomic effects. So what you get is a massive effort at storytelling, and then you get a bunch of peer review panels who don't have a collective method for assessing this stuff, but somehow have to produce an answer as to which of these have big effects and which of them have small effects. So what in practice you get is a rather intransparent process of groupthink within peer review panels, leading to judgments that they actually in the end can't explain. Within this tradition, there seems to be a bit of a retreat from attribution to contribution. It's easier to demonstrate I made some contribution to an impact than it is to say, well, how much was that, and how crucial was it? When we look at the third generation of funding instruments, it's clear that these are much more complex, because we're dealing with societal effects, societal activities, as well as technical ones, if you like. Projects are going to need to focus much more on problems than the demand side.
Eric, could we perhaps ask you to
Yeah.
wrap up? This is, of course, the important part of your presentation, but perhaps, because we have to keep an eye on time.
Yeah. I have 2 slides left, and then I think I'll just hit my time limit, if I may. Okay. So a key issue then is stronger user involvement in problem definition and legitimation. A bigger role for actors downstream from research and innovation in the process of realizing impact, and therefore a wider set of actors in governance. This I can skip in a sense. Where we end up, I think, or where we're likely to end up in the way we think about impact is by treating it in different levels. Evaluating in a fairly traditional way programs and portfolios, At the other extreme, actually looking at the overall system health. And I think a lot of the attention is going to go on improving the processes at the bottom and middle levels, and being more sort of accounting based at the level of trying to understand how the socio-technical systems we're interested in are actually changing. Okay, so I think that's then likely to, I'd hope it does, change the way we think about impacts in university research. And that's me done. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Eric. And your wide background was so obvious. This is really the philosophy and the history of science and society. So thank you very much for giving us that broad, wide view. We will now move on to the last talk, which is by Stephen Hallgate. And Stephen Hallgate has devoted his career to focusing on the interface between science, clinical application, and then impact on shaping policy. He's been associated for the larger part of and the better part of his career with Southampton, the University of Southampton. His research has focused on understanding allergy and asthma, so that's the science aspect, and then treatment of those conditions, so pharmacology. This also led him to be the co-founder of a university spin-off, developing respiratory drugs. And then he's also one of the world's foremost and very outspoken spokespeople on the dangerous impact of air pollution. And this last aspect of his work may well have been one of the factors why he was given a knighthood, to which he reacted in a wonderful way by saying, "I'm astonished to receive this honor." But looking back on a lifetime of research, translating biological science into human disease and then improving human health as a consequence has been a rewarding journey in its own right. I'm truly most fortunate to have experienced this. And so we are very fortunate to have you here to talk about how to include societal impact in academic research, an exercise of looking forward and back.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that over-exaggerated introduction, and I'm very grateful to be part of this most fascinating conversation today. What I want to really talk about is an experience I had when impact was first introduced into the university assessment system. Whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, we can discuss, but the process is already in place and started in 2014, as Eric said, has just completed in 2021 for the next period. And I want to just explain a little bit about what all this is about. In the United Kingdom, we have two forms of funding of research. We have the government contributions to the higher education institutes directly, and then we have grants like any other country has, either from the charitable or from the government sector. It's the first area, that is the direct funding of universities and their departments, that is being assessed in terms of the quality of the research. And in 2014, beyond the quality of research and the environment in which it takes place, the impact it may be having over time. And this, as Eric carefully explained in his talk, is undertaken by expert panels. I was fortunate enough to be chair of main panel A, which is the medical and life sciences panel. And you can see in the bottom of this slide, the process that universities are asked to go through. Now, this is no mean task. It's a fantastically large and rather expensive exercise to try and extract the quality of research and its subsequent movement into societal impact over time. And the way the panels are set up is that they consist both of academics and of users of research, stakeholders. And the users of research and stakeholders are particularly asked to be involved in the impact assessment, the first of which took place in 2014. And there you can see a brief summary across the whole of the United Kingdom of the outputs and the impact case studies that were involved in this exercise, and the proportional scoring when it comes to rating a university unit of assessment, with 65% going on research outputs, 20% on the impact, and 15% on the environment. I think the importance of impact, whether we're doing it correctly or not, I don't know, as we move into 2021, has been recognized, because in this last exercise, you will see that there's been a further increment in the proportion of the score attributed to impact, and lesser on the outputs slightly, and the environment much the same. So the whole idea of assessing impact is done around two basic platforms. The panels are asked to look at case studies that are constructed on a template form, where the underpinning research is described and the references, no more than 6, given, how the research led to the eventual impact that is being described, the beneficiaries of that impact, and then you are asked to give independent indicators of the use of that impact, and where possible to make that numerical rather than simply qualitative or descriptive. And that these, of course, have got to then be independently corroborated by third parties. All the material has to be presented on the form. And of course, the important thing here is that case studies need not be representative of the overall research activity in a particular unit of assessment. So you're going to try and pick the strongest case studies as possible. The second pillar of impact assessment is the use of a template, which describes how a university unit of assessment and the university as a whole is supporting the journey from the research discovery to the passage of that research to those that can best use it, and to lay out an approach and strategy to move the research along the chain such that impact is eventually realized. And these are all scored by the panels, as Eric briefly described. In REF 2021, this last one that's just been completed, the impact template has been incorporated into the environment template. Now, each case study must be underpinned by research, and this indicates the definitions. In 2014, the research had to be undertaken between 1993 and 2013, a decade to enable the journey of translation to occur. The research, at least one of the submissions has to be at least 2-star, that is internationally competitive, and the material has to make a distinct contribution to the impact, the research material. Okay, and overall, the impact case study is assessed for its reach and significance. Those are the two criteria. So, as Eric again mentioned, a comprehensive and coherent narrative, talking through the journey from the discovery through the intermediate phases to the point where it's influencing society, has to be described. The evidence for this being written down and where possible referred to objectively. And then, of course, the impact itself, which can take many, many different forms. And we've already heard some discussions on what the impact might look like, from technological developments to policy to medical diagnostic tests or whatever. And then the key thing about all of this is the independent verification that the impact is doing what it says on the tin. The next, obviously, part of this whole process is to assess the reach and significance. And this is an overall assessment that each of the panels has to make. It's not a geographical reach. It's reach as appropriate to the nature and target of that impact. And the template, which is the second pillar of the impact assessment in 2014, is considering the extent to which the unit of assessment's approach was conducive to achieving impacts. Threshold criteria are built into the assessment process. I won't read through these because you can see them there on this slide. They're fairly straightforward. And obviously, in giving a score, this is a view that the panel has to agree to. And these are the scoring system that's used, starting with the unclassified, if the impact did not actually conform to the definitions given to the universities, then moving all the way up to eventually 4-star, which is an outstanding impact. And then the university units of assessment are all assessed for their outputs, the research papers, etc., the impact, which I've just talked about, and the environment in which students and others are able to prosecute their research journey, hopefully towards impact. And these are all added up and rated, and you can see overall scores are given. And at the end of the day, a whole university can be scored by aggregating some of these numbers. Well, this is the panel that I was involved with, main panel A. You can see it's made up of 6 units of assessment, and you can see the outputs, the impact and the environment and the relative scores. And I think the important thing here is that the scores do vary markedly between the various units of assessment, in that there are different stages at which they're able to contribute the academic activity. Whether it be outputs, whether it be impacts or the environment. This shows the 154 universities in the United Kingdom, and each color there represents the outputs in blue, the impact in orange or brown, and the environment in green. And you can see that there's a gradation all the way down to the bottom, as you would expect if one was assessing these different criteria. And the amount of money that goes to the unit of assessments dictated by the departments of science in our country are dictated by these scores. So just a little conclusion from my experience of this 2014 exercise. This gives you some overall figures that 44% of the impacts were judged to be outstanding, and a further 40% very considerable. And you can see that in the bottom bullet point there, the wide variety of areas where impacts have been described. In fact, in this last exercise, 180 separate themes have evolved as being building up the impact portfolio. And here you can see the sort of process, what happens from the field of research on the left of this alluvial diagram, and the type of impact on the right. And you can see that obviously in red, it's the panel that I chaired, the health and life sciences, that there was a tremendous range of research activities that fed into a tremendous range of impacts at the end of the day. But there was clustering, as you would expect, with the different 4 main panels. So in conclusion, over 80% of the impact case studies that were submitted demonstrated multi or interdisciplinary research. And this is a key finding of the 14 ref exercise. There were very wide-ranging topics with 60 unique impact topics identified in this 2014, but many more are being identified in 2021. Unique pathways have been uncovered where research can be moved along the channels towards developing impact more rapidly, and also that the higher education institutes were obviously not only contributing to economic and technical advances, but very considerable societal impact, not only in the United Kingdom and Europe, but in the world in its various manifestations. The interdisciplinary is something I want to strongly emphasize, as I do the equality and diversity, which is another aspect of the translational journey that came out very positively. And finally, it was clear that each higher education institute, university, specialized in different types of impact. And I think as we go forward in 2021, when the results come through this May, it'll be very interesting comparing the results of this recent exercise with what happened in 2014. And I think, if I may, Karen, I want to say that this whole exercise means that impact is having a global influence and not just a national or a European one. And I think it's this global impact which generated so much excitement during the evaluation process. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Well, a really beautiful presentation and very instructive about the REF, which is an impressive instrument and so an impressive framework. And so we also look very much forward to learning more about the most recent version now, to which Eric gave us a philosophical frame of reference too. So we have come at the end of the presentations. Once again, on behalf of all the participants in this webinar, very many thanks for all the thought and time you put into preparing very impressive presentations. And we move on to the next section now, and Dirk will present some questions that came in from the participants in this webinar to you.
Yes, as was announced, the people who are able to ask some questions, and I have a list over here, so I will try to move through them and ask several of you some questions. One of the main themes which came up is the collaboration and the problem-focused nature you need for creating impact. The impact, the societal impact, can stem from a more problem-focused from funders, but at the same time you need also actions which go beyond traditional research and innovation actions. I think also Louise stressed this part at the beginning of her presentation. But one of the questions is, does that mean that universities will have a different role in the future, that they have to take up other activities, or do we need to have just more collaboration? But in that case, can it also not be a danger for the independence of a researcher, for the more curiosity-driven ones? And probably, Louise, you can share some thoughts about it. I think Eric can also, but I would first ask this question to Louise.
I think it's a very fundamental question, and we've come across it many, many times in the discussion on the research agenda as well. Coming from the medical field, in a university medical center where you get a new generation of students every academic year, where the research labs are next to the patient care units, the idea that you're working towards something that's going to help these patients out in the hospital is so much part of the way you think that you don't need that extra pull to bring a research question into the open in society to be picked up and have impact. I think that's different in some of the other fields where there is not always so much interaction with the people who ultimately could use and benefit from the results. And what I tried to say in my presentation is that sometimes you can help by being more open about your research without already having an intention about which problem you're going to solve. Because let others use your outcomes to do something useful with it. But it does mean that you open up the sometimes very closed environment of a university where people amongst themselves know exactly what's happening, know exactly the ranking of the different researchers there. In the outside world, even just because of the use of the words that you use, have no idea what it means. And what we found in that research agenda was that if you were willing to spend a little bit of time, it turns out that the things people out in society are interested in or would like to know more about are not very different from what's being done within the research community, except sometimes the words are slightly different. So I would much more try to open up the university to society and let society pull out what's relevant. But it does need the help of the research community to do that.
So it's just more than open science, it's also helping to translate your knowledge to a language, the
well,
uptake
and not primarily your knowledge, but your excitement for working in that field. Because I always find that it is the excitement that a researcher has about why what he or she's doing is so ultimately important that also triggers society to think about what they could do with that or why they would want to know it as well.
I feel the excitement, and that's a strong thing.
Yeah.
I have a totally different question, I think, for Stephen, for Professor Hallgate. You showed us the impact from the whole university-based over a period of 20 years. The REF framework, it's based the impact really of one university. But does it make sense to translate that approach to every individual researcher or to projects? Because that's sometimes what funders try to do right now.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful question. And of course, the REF exercise does not assess individuals. It assesses actually the unit of assessment. And obviously the university has to make choices as to what they're going to put forward. And in the one that I was involved with, they could select. But this last one, there's no selection. Everything had to go in that the universities were actually researching on. And so that sort of picking and choosing, which I think probably might have created some imbalance in the process, was now removed. I think the other thing I'd just like to add on this point is that compared to 2008, 2014, and now 2021, the number of authors on research papers and the number of people and the variety of different disciplines that have come together to create the impact is increased markedly. And what it's done for the institutions is to create an interdisciplinary environment and start breaking down some of these silos that we traditionally have always had in our universities that in fact interferes with free collaboration across the divides.
I think that's an intriguing.
I would like to support that, because I've also noticed that the excitement I talked about earlier is greatly enhanced when you suddenly bring together groups that didn't know that they were basically working on the same kind of thing, and that how much they can learn from each other into bringing it further. So I was very happy to see that conclusion from your presentation, Stephen.
Yes, thank you, Louise. Yeah.
So we can see perhaps the missions funders are writing also as calls for us to go and sit together and exchange knowledge and our expertise and then trying to solve the problems. I think that can be a major contribution to impact here. But one of the other questions which arises here, and probably that's one for Eric, is at the end you also point that those socio-technical systems in which impact is created. Do you have an idea who has to organize the shift from research to society? Is this just the university who is in lead, or are there other parties we have to join, or because it's a very complex system at the end? So what's our role there in this socio-technical system and creating the impact?
If by our role you mean the university's role, then I think it is to be quite deliberate about getting involved at the definition of problems level, engaging therefore with more organizations and more people outside the traditional research and innovation system. in a sense, you can't just go and ask consumers what what the problems are. We need expertise at the level of problems as well. And the universities, I think, have massive amounts of expertise to contribute there. And in a sense, this is an extension of something we've painfully learned over several decades of research on research and innovation. That and if you want to have impact in society from research, you have to have an understandable connection between the research and the problems that it's trying to address. This goes back to things like Project Sappho at Sprue in the early 1970s, where they made the astonishing discovery by looking at matched pairs of firms and innovations that the companies who had innovations and were closely connected to understanding their users' needs were much more successful than the companies who innovated without particularly knowing about demand. And it's on one level, it's really as crude and as simple as that. But this builds it up to the social level. That's I think really quite important. I was fascinated, if I may say so, by the stuff on interdisciplinarity, Stephen, in particular. Because I ran the team that put an evidence report together for the 2016 Stern Review, looking at how and whether the REF should be changed. And I seem to recall, if I got the numbers right, that in the 2014 REF review, something like 33% of the publications that were looked at were interdisciplinary in nature. Let me get this right. Sorry, it was something like 16% were interdisciplinary, whereas if you look at all the publications in the UK, about a third of them were interdisciplinary. So what was going on was that the university managers were selecting out interdisciplinary work from the REF because they were too nervous about their ability to predict how the panels would treat the stuff. There's some quite interesting work by Jonathan Adams when he was with evidence on exactly. And then you point at the richness of this stuff in terms of impact. What a contrast.
Yes. Yeah, if I may say something about that, the 2021, we did learn from the 2014. That was the first time impact was being assessed in this sort of systematic way. But I think one of the things that came out was whether one should be assessing super impacts. In other words, scoring something from 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, but maybe there's something actually that's 8. In other words, we're talking here about completely transformational. And I think hitting the ceiling is always an issue when you're assessing impact. The target audience, is the important one. And if we had a discovery, for example, that completely removed malaria from the world, that might be regarded as a super impact, as opposed to, managing a community issue. So I think these aspects, these qualitative and quantitative aspects of impact, which you alluded to actually in the way you very nicely illustrated the drawing together of all of these different channels to make these complex impacts work, and your train journey illustrated that. I think that's something we're going to have to put much more thought into, because most problems in life now are complex and are highly wicked problems in that they need multiple ways of approaching them, and thinking of it as along a single track, which in a way is what the REF initially was set up to do, I think oversimplifies the whole process.
Can I ask you a question, Stephen, about the REF? By assessing impact, do you think you're going to improve impact as well?
Yeah.
Well, it'd be quite interesting to see what happens this time around, because one of the questions that came up is, can you reuse an impact?
Yeah.
Previous.
Yeah.
If it's having more impact.
Yeah.
So these are questions. So I think what's happened in this last exercise is we've got much more involvement of stakeholders and much more involvement of members of society in the process
Okay.
Whereas I think when we initially did it, it was a mixture of academics. I think the stakeholders, which you emphasized in your talk, are absolutely crucial here, the users of research.
Yeah.
But we'll see what 2021 throws up. It may be
Okay.
the last one we ever do, but we'll see.
Thanks for the interesting question. It's nice that even our members are interrogating each other. But we also have a question from Karin over here.
Yeah, if I may, I'd like to ask a question to Eric on his last presentation, where he integrated the different levels of evaluation and set at the top the analysis of system health. How is this going to come about? We are getting into some practice of peer review, evaluation, but this is a totally different level of evaluation. How do you see that?
I mean, we in the evaluation community are struggling. Let me be completely honest. How on earth do we, in a sensible way, evaluate transitions or missions, these huge things? And I think we can take a little bit of inspiration, if you like, from the climate change, which the neatness of climate change is that there's actually one very simple parameter you're trying to play with. Right at the top of the hierarchy is get the carbon out of the system. So you've got a very, very simple indicator of system health. In many other cases, it's more complex. It's quite interesting if you look at the structure of the implementation of the climate change objectives in the UK, and I don't suppose it's very different from what's going on in other countries. We have a climate change committee which monitors and evaluates the attempts to reach the emissions targets. We've got a layer of programming below that involving departments of state, and below that we've got programs and projects. So what's actually going on there is in effect 3 levels of evaluation. There's a nitty-gritty one down at the project level, where we can use fairly standard traditional techniques. There's something more complex in the middle, and then there's a very different perspective right at the top. I mean, we do this in the OECD at the national level, looking at the National Innovation System reviews, where somehow one attempts to analyze the systemic health of an entire national innovation system, and it sort of works. But it's tough, and it involves thinking in levels, which is something we've not really done much before in evaluation, because these things are so complex that they need multi-level governance.
It's intriguing that you refer to the complexity of measuring the impact at this high level, because a lot of questions I get in here from our audience are referring to the complexity of measuring impact at the project level itself, because impact is often something which is created along the years over and over some projects. And now they ask, for example, the impact framework, the REF framework, is it meaningful to use that also at a department level or totally not? And are there better ways to measure this impact at this low level?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that, the REF panels continue to ask themselves. When is an impact an impact? What's a partial impact? How far down the road do you need to go to call it an impact? And I think these are judgments which I think Eric referred to rather negatively, and I think he's correct to do that, by the way, is that these are human judgments. This is a panel of people largely made up of those that are using whatever it is, assessing the impact. The important thing about the REF is it's the impact that's being assessed, not the research. The research has previously been assessed that contributed to the impact, 8 or 10 years ago, whatever it is, but it's actually the impact itself. I think the judgmental aspect of all of this, the human sort of side of it, the panel, the experts and the stakeholders, this is where the key lies, really. And I think after this 21 exercise, they're going to have a very careful think about how much of this actually should be passed completely to society to make judgments on. And by that, I mean industry and all of the components of so, rather than have academics as part of that assessment process, because that's where it is at the moment. It's a kind of hybrid. And that the academic side can be a separate process, which might help. But we'll have to see. Let's see how the 2021 turns out.
I'm desperate to jump in, if I may.
I saw your hand, so I want to give you the word. Please.
Look, we all agree about the importance of bottom-up research, but if it really is blue skies research, the extent of and timing of impacts are probably down to luck.
Yeah.
Now, do you really want to be assessed on how lucky you are? The more thematic stuff, which is problem-oriented, we've got a sense of what the goal is, and we can actually regard impact as a meaningful thing to try and measure. We need also to think about the time dimension, and again, it's intriguing in relation to the ref. There are two landmark studies in my field in the 1960s. One is called Hindsight, which was commissioned by the American Department of Defense because Congress was complaining that it was wasting its money doing research. Hindsight traced back where ideas in current weapons development came from, and they came from DoD funded research 20 years earlier in 85% of the cases. National Science Foundation got really, really annoyed that there'd been this demonstration of the relevance of applied research. So they ran a project called Traces, which looked 50 plus years back into fundamental science, and of course found links there. So two observations. Both blue skies and applied research seem to have big effects, or can have big effects. We need both. The time scales involved are very, very long.
Can I raise a question to that? Because
you can raise a question, but I also have a question for you, which is related to the previous one. So,
okay.
What do you prefer?
Well, of course, I will first answer your question. I wouldn't dare to come in with another one. Come on.
Well, it's just a question about the risk, because if we move more to this impact-driven approach within research, what's the risk that it becomes a type of popularity test? Instead of really, really good research at the end, curiosity-driven, but the impact model, would it lead to more a type of popularity, a Facebook type of liking?
Well, when I look back at the number of the type of questions that came in from the general public, first of all, they were very, very diverse, and they could be leading towards blue skies research rather than applied problem-solving research. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the general public. I think they're quite smart and they're quite widely interested. Yes, there is a certain amount of popularity, but it's interesting where it lies. What I was struck by when we did the research agenda, and that was also the question I was going to put to Eric, is the enormous popularity of astronomy. Right through the general public, people are willing to put a lot of money into astronomy, even though it's not going to have any direct results. It's not going to answer the question whether there's life outside of planet Earth. They simply are fascinating by what's happening. And I like that, because I think that science is not always about solving the problems of today or tomorrow. It's also allowing people to use their imagination and curiosity about things that are much bigger than that. And that is impact on society as well, because it offers a horizon that goes beyond the 2 years that we might be normally looking at. And that's why I liked Eric's results that you presented about the 50-year perspective. And the interesting part is that I think the general public understands that very well, and we should not underestimate them.
Which is a very clear message, but go ahead, Eric, probably to react to the question Louise had about the 50 years and the popularity of astronomy.
Yeah, one's always tempted in these kinds of discussions into simple analyses of complex phenomena.
Yeah.
I mean, if you listen to the astronomers, they very often justify their expensive kit based on the fact that it makes school children happy and be very excited about science. And yeah, well,
Never them.
A world in which we don't study astronomy for the hell of it, or don't love opera, even though most people don't like it, you know, isn't worth living in.
Exactly.
And that's the same world in which we also worry about industrial impacts and all the rest of the stuff.
Yeah.
And part of the robustness that we need, I think, in our university system is the ability to do different things at the same time. It's not all about blue skies research. It's not all about impact.
No.
It's not all about money. You know, we're actually doing many things. Being able to cope with the facts that you have to walk on two legs and chew gum at the same time seems to be beyond some people, but I think we need to understand it.
Yeah.
It's about finding a balance. I think that's a very, very good answer. And I think we also have to close all the interesting questions. I'm just looking at the time, and we also want to round up a bit at the end of this interesting seminar. I will give the floor to Karin to just...
Yes, thank you very much. We still have lots of questions. We may come back to you. But I think one of the, and I'm not going to try and wrap up everything that has been said. It's been a very rich discussion, and thank you very much for joining us. We will, as we said, use your input in the report we are preparing and share what you have presented with the broader community. So thank you very much for joining us. And there's another ending here with welcome our Vice Rector for Research, Jan Doge, who has some words for you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I feel a bit like the pedel in the Netherlands, walking in to end the session. I've never done that before. But I wanted to thank, well, first of all, the panel members here, Karin and Christine and Dirk, for guiding us through this webinar. I also want to explicitly thank Gerard Seelen. He has been very instructive and critical to the setup of this webinar. He's working here in the background, so also thank you, Gerard. And then, of course, I want to thank the speakers for their insightful presentations and discussion. And as a small token of our appreciation, we want to hand you over this book. Of course, I cannot hand it over right now, but we will send it to you. It's a book titled Utopia, and there was one written like it, well, several centuries ago by Thomas More. This is a renewed version by authors of our university, and they give their vision on how the ideal society will look like, given the current insights. So with that, this book will be coming your way. I hope you'll enjoy reading it, and thank you again for being here today. Thank you all for being here today, and hope to see you at the next occasion. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.